Next guest is Brett Morgen. He is an Oscar-nominated filmmaker whose titles include On the Ropes, The Kid Stays in the Picture, Chicago 10, Cobain, Montage of Heck, and his new film that is making its world premiere at TIFF this week, it's had a couple screenings already, is Jane, about Jane Goodall, who is here with us on Sunday. It was very exciting. Each one of the films I've just named of Brett's has a different filmmaking approach suitable to its subjects. If people remember The Kid Stays in the Picture that he made with Nanette Burstein, who was actually a guest here last year. In that film, they're looking at the life of Robert Evans, and they were kind of pioneers in using still images with a kind of motion control on them that, I know for all my filmmaking friends, we were all super jazzed about that. And then, a year later, that was like a cliche, but they were really the first to do it. In Chicago 10, he used animation. In his last film, Cobain, Montage of Heck, he used all kinds of different animation and different sources. So each film, he's really reinventing a new way to tell it. And in the case of Jane, he gained access to 140 hours of beautiful 16mm footage shot of Jane Goodall in the early 60s when she had first arrived, or soon after she had first arrived, at Gombe Stream National Park, where she did all of her groundbreaking research. So in this film, he combines that footage with a new, very forthcoming interview with Jane and a brand new score by Philip Glass. Let's watch a couple minutes from Jane. Please welcome the filmmaker, Brett Morgen.
Thank you.
Brett, as I understand it, this wasn't a project that originated out of your head. It was brought to you. Can you explain that?
Yeah, last February, I received a call from National Geographic saying they had just seen Kurt, and were fans of the Montage of Heck, and wanted to talk to me about doing a film
February 2016.
2016, yeah. And 2015.
Okay.
And they wanted to do a film about Jane Goodall, and I was just sort of, literally was like the wrong number, because I'd just done Kurt and Bob Evans and the Rolling Stones, and it just didn't seem like a natural flow. But I got on the call, and they eventually sent me some footage. And one of the things they sent me was a film from 1965 called Miss Goodall and the Chimpanzees, which was the second National Geographic film that Orson Welles narrated. And it's one of the most amazing documents of its time, but it's very much they made documentaries in a very different style and tradition back then, so Orson's narrating every action that happens. Jane looks left, Jane looks right, and it seemed that with 140 hours that there was a possibility to do something a little more immersive and to use the technologies that we have available to us today, both in color grading and in audio construction, to invite the audience to be on that magical journey with Jane back in 1960.
And so National Geographic had the keys to the archive that had this 140 hours stored. But as I understand it, it was not easy to make your way through this 140 hours. Can you talk about that challenge?
Yeah, there was actually something in the Hollywood Reporter the other day where it said, Nat Geographic at Brett Morgen, 140 hours. It was any documentarian's dream. And if it was that, it would have been a total dream. I thought it was a dream. I thought they said, we're sending you these drives. They've already been digitized. You could bring your editor in and go to work tomorrow. And I'm like, we're going to get this film done in 9 months. Like, this is going to be a breeze. And in fact, we're aiming for last year's New York Film Festival. Totally missed it by a year. And we started screening the footage, and it became clear instantly that what we had received were 140 hours worth of shots. There were no 2 consecutive shots that originated from the same camera reel. So it was completely scrambled.
The dream was a nightmare.
The dream was a nightmare. And it's all MOS on top of that. And there's a lot of chimpanzees, and they don't have name tags.
No sound exists for any of this.
No, no. And I'm really bad with facial and name recognition with my friends, and so having to make sense of this footage was bloody hell. And so,
because we should be clear here, you don't really get it from this clip, but the chimpanzees that she was working with really became her friends and family. So it's not like it matters that you can't tell who the chimpanzees are.
Correct, and her study was mainly focused on one family of chimpanzees, and so for the film project, those were the ones that were relevant and important. However, there were 160 chimpanzees who lived on the Gombe forest, and there's whoever wanted to come into play came into play. So yeah, just to be able to screen the footage became an epic tale. We ended up having to, we built a 7-1 mix stage at our office, and we brought in a sound editor before we brought in picture editor 2 years ago. And what we did was we acquired, through the Jane Goodall Institute, 55 years worth of audio recordings, and then began the inevitable task of trying to create synchronized chimp sounds for the film.
And how close were you getting? I mean, when you had access to these audio recordings, did you have audio recordings of specific chimpanzees that matched the chimps in the film?
We didn't have like Flo's voice per se, but the film was after we did our work, the technical people came through and were like, this thing is like totally on point. I had this, financially, to hire a sound editor for 2 years is like, it's
money.
It's money. So I got really lucky and hired some kid who just graduated from SC and paid him really nothing. But it was like his first job, and he had this fancy 7-1 room, and he was stoked and sat in there for 2 years.
And you just put food in under the door?
Sipped in some bananas. And then I remember when we hired, the film was, we brought in the sound designer who recently just did Beauty and the Beast, and he's a big Hollywood guy. And I was assuming he was going to sort of redo all the stuff. And once he saw how the thing, he's like, I think we should keep Josh on the project, and maybe I'll just give him all the chimp vocalizations.
So, getting access to Jane Goodall herself is not that easy a thing. She's a busy woman. I'm told she spends 300 days a year on the road carrying out the causes of her Jane Goodall Institute. And maybe this film wasn't as big a deal to her as it was to you. Can you talk about what that interaction was like, getting her on board of the project?
Sure. I think anyone here who makes films knows that it's a lot easier to make a film. Any film is a collaboration between the subject and the filmmaker. And if you don't have that collaboration, it's just an uphill battle, unless you're Nick Broomfield, in which case it's a blessing. And but Jane, Jane had no interest in having this film made.
She's written her memoirs.
12 books.
Yeah.
She's done 12 books. There have been films going back to 1965. She's on the lecture circuit 300 days a year. So when the call came from our production to arrange for an interview, they really were treating us like a ENG crew, Electric News Gathering, And you can film her. She's going to be at this conference. You can have a couple minutes backstage. And we're like, no, we're actually, we need to we're going to build a set. We're going to, it's a very complicated sort of setup. And finally, they acquiesced and gave us 2 days. And
she said on stage that she thought it was going to be 3 hours.
She thought it was going to be 3 hours, and it was literally one of those things. And she's not rude. I don't want this to come off as rude, but she would sit down and is like, "What do you want to know?" And the first thing I asked her was, I was like, "Jane, so let me ask you. You've told your story so many times before. Do you ever get tired of telling it?" Which, for documentary filmmakers, that was a completely preconceived idea to open the film with. Open the film with her talking about, because we all know she's told the story so many times, acknowledging it. It's sort of a bit postmodern, if you will. And so I go, so do you get tired of telling your story? And she said, very straight-faced, "Well, it depends on the interviewer." I was like, touche. And she was...
What else had you done to prepare for that? I mean, I assume you'd read her books. Had you talked to anyone who knew her? Had you developed a psychological profile of her to come in with a strategy about how to approach this?
Yeah, I think the one thing with my film, with archival films, a little side story about Chicago 10. Tom Hayden called me up one day when he knew I was making the film, and
he's one of the subjects of Chicago 10. One of the subjects of Chicago 10. You kind of key.
The quietest guy in the courtroom. Not to take anything away from Tom as an amazing, one of the greatest social activists of the last 50 years, and who passed away recently. But Tom called me up and goes, "I don't get it. Why aren't you sitting down with me to go through stuff?" And I was like, "Well, Tom, unless you have an encyclopedic knowledge of the 1,400 hours of film I have, it's not going to help me, because my movie is made of this archival footage." And so that's how I learned the subject. And I read everything I can. I've read all your books, Tom. So I have that as background. And it becomes this sort of, I think there's a certain truth to that. And in fact, I remember on Chicago 10 as well, some yippies getting really mad at me when they saw the film, saying, "The first night in Chicago was totally peaceful, and you made it seem like a riot." And I was like, we could look at the camera slates, and memory has a way of being quite slippery. And so I tend to trust the footage. And with Jane, I had read all of her books, and I had seen all the footage, so I didn't really have any need to talk to her before I started making the film. I had books on tapes to draw from. I had just a wealth of material. So, as I do in all my movies, I cut the film before I did the interview. We did the same thing on Montage of Heck, and we do it for a very specific reason. If you can cut a film before you layer in your interviews, you are absolutely never going to have a film in which the visuals become slavish, or like are filler for something. Your film, first and foremost, will speak to us visually. And then you can start to take it back as you put in the interviews. The other reason is...
And I'm curious, when you were doing that, were you slating in any like
Slugs.
scratch narration, like reading from her book or something, just to kind of have some ideas about?
So on the kids' season, the picture, I was, when we were doing the offline on that, I learned how to do a pretty good Bob. Top, we could, I don't know what this conversation is about, but... So it worked very well, and I could actually go from Bob's voice to my voice as I was scratching out track, sort of fluidly. My Jane Goodall is not so great. So like, you could sort of throw in slug. Like, I remember one time we tried to bring in this actor to just slug some lines for us, and it took you right out of everything. So we put up cards that say what the line would be.
Okay.
And then we started slugging in stuff from the book on tape. But one of the other reasons I was telling you this the other day, that we do the interview after the fact, is I light the interviews so that the lighting is specific and reflective to what they're talking about. So the lighting changes throughout. If you've seen Montage of Heck, in the film, there's 5 interviews, and the whole film, the first interview, all the interviews begin in daylight and then drop into night. And it's a effect I stole from the movie Lenny. And the intended effect is that it feels like you're sitting around a campfire and people are just pouring it out. And also montage, all of the interviews were on sets. Which is something I don't think people realize, or they're not supposed to realize. And that was because in so many times when you go to interview someone, they say, well, I'm going to be at this hotel room.
Right.
And I feel as a filmmaker, we have such limited tools to communicate our visions, particularly in archival filmmaking. A director's toolkit as an archival filmmaker is color grading, montage, sound design. That's it. That's the only way we could sort of get our voice in there. When you add interviews, now you open up this whole world of possibilities. And I always have a knee-jerk reaction when I feel like the background is in service to the subject, that I feel too often people underutilize that medium in terms of that is our time to talk. That is, especially in the archive sense, this is our moment to sort of make, and the only way you can really have conscious construction of lighting and that stuff is if you already know where the interview is going to go. Obviously, keeping your ears open for new possibilities, but taking them on that
In the case of Jane Goodall, you got a pretty good roadmap about where the interview is going to go.
Exactly, Tom. I had the map, and at the very least, if we were going to go off in an area, I would keep it specific to the time of her life that we were talking about, so it would match the
So to go back to this moment where Jane Goodall says it depends on the interviewer, I feel like you have some split-second decisions to make about how you're going to come across. Are you going to be aggressive? Are you going to be gentle? Are you, what tone are you going to adopt?
Hard.
Hard? Is that
I think so. I think I was like, all right, if we're going to play this way, then. But no, the thing ultimately becomes when you're interviewing someone older. One of the keys is, I think, to find ways to jog their memory. And Jane can talk all day long about chimpanzees and Gombe, but my film is not about the chimpanzees. I wanted to call the film Observed because it's not. You think it's going to be Jane observing the chimpanzees, but really we're observing Jane throughout the film. And, I lost my train of thought.
So, I mean, you said that you decide you're going to go at her hard.
Oh, yeah. So then So she
Turn the lights up.
Yeah, so she was fine talking about chimps, but when it came to talking anything off script, she really, memory wasn't there.
Because I should say, for people who haven't seen this film, this is an epic love story.
Yeah.
I mean, partly her love for the chimps, but also the relationship she had with that cameraman, and her child being born,
Yeah.
and the dissolution of that relationship, and so.
Thanks for giving the whole film away.
All right.
Where were we? Okay, so after the first day of interviews, I realized that Hugo, it was really becoming problematic with her talking about Hugo because it had been many years since she had gone back to that space.
Right.
And so I love that Frost Nixon movie, how, after the first round, you go back and you sort of like, okay, what can I do differently tomorrow? And you go back in. And I think when I came back the next day, I told Ellen Kiris, our cinematographer, who was moving the lights forward as if we're moving forward in the days, I was like, I'm really sorry, we're going to have to begin with morning light from yesterday because I need to mine back some Hugo stuff. And I went and I showed Jane the sequence of the film that was cut where her and Hugo fall in love. And it
What you'd cut out of archival
that we'd already cut,
yeah,
that had 3 minutes of footage that she'd never seen. And you could just see it. You could see it happening to her. And then she sort of was much warmer and looser. And the thing is, you as a director directing an interview, if someone is not, I find it no different than directing fiction, in that if they give me an answer and it's not the way that I know it needs to be heard in the film, I'm going to keep going there. I may say, okay, I'm going to come back on that one, but I'm going to try to, and even if I have to explain to them emotionally what I'm trying to achieve, as long as the words are theirs and not mine, it's and listen, sometimes you get people who are I get tongue-tied in front of a camera as well, so it's
happens to the best of them.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about the sound design and the score. Can you talk about the decisions that you made in that respect, particularly hiring Philip Glass?
Sure. When I started the project, the idea was to create this completely immersive experience, through sound design, and I didn't know how much Jane's narration I would need. We ended up requiring more than I initially thought. So therefore, it was going to need a hook. I don't mean a marketing hook, but something to hold it all together. And my movies tend to be slightly operatic, in fact, the kid sees in the picture literally opens with the sound of an orchestra tuning up under the USA Films logo. And then you hear and then the red curtains show up and they part and the orchestra kicks in. I mean, and then the last note of the movie is that it swells up to that. So it's an area that I'm very comfortable in, I enjoy working in. This was very much intended to be a cinematic opera. And there were really only two people that came to mind. Brian Eno, because of For All Mankind, which is probably the film that had the biggest influence on the type of movies I wanted to make.
Which maybe you should say for a word about what For All Mankind
sorry,
is.
For All Mankind, if you haven't seen it, there's a Criterion edition of it. It won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance in 1989. It's a movie that's made up entirely of NASA stock footage. And what the filmmaker did was basically take all of the NASA missions and sort of all the Apollo missions and sort of make them one. So you're not having to back up and go forward. So it's like, you see all the guys training, then you see it going up in the ship, they go to the moon, they come back. And it's voiceover off-camera voiceover from various astronauts with a beautiful Brian Eno score. Which Tom showed, I believe.
I showed it in New York.
You showed it in New York a couple years ago, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, really, if you have a chance, you have to see it.
I'd say I showed it in New York due to a great deal of your proselytizing about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyways, so Eno doesn't score the picture. And I knew that would not work. Our film was going to be too narratively driven.
Yeah.
Ever since I saw the movie Mishima, I've wanted to work with John Bailey and Philip Glass. And I got to work with Bailey on The Kid Stays in the Picture. And this, we had the budget for him, and it just seemed like he would add, to me, Jane Goodall and Philip Glass are the same. Just huge titans in their field, both in their early 80s. There was a symmetry to that I just wholeheartedly embrace. Philip was almost entirely unaware of Jane's work and her research. I
can't imagine that he's like an easy guy to book.
We delayed our film in part because of him, because he had some scheduling.
So, what did it take to win him over to the project?
Well, I wasn't going to send a Montage of Heck. I didn't think that would go over well. And so he didn't know my work. And but what I did was I sent him an early cut sequence that we had done with some of his temp on it. And he fell in love with Hugo cinematography initially. When he sent me his first 5 cues, which that was one of them that we just heard, he had fallen in love with Jane. My big concern with Philip, and it probably was more not my concern, but other producers and people in production, was Philip's music tends to be can be cold, and we needed a very warm, emotional score, and so we sort of rolled the dice, and like I said, Philip clearly...
I feel like he really delivered in that respect.
He really delivered. Yeah.
Now, what do you do when you get a Philip Glass track and it's like not quite working for you? Like, how's that phone call? Like, Philip, I don't know how you tell you this, but it's just not working for me.
Oh, it starts off very gently, and about 2 months in, it is very abrasive. Because, I mean, absolutely right, Tom. I never went to music school, and I learned on the first time I was working with a composer what a terrible disadvantage it is to be a director and not know how to speak their language, because then you literally end up humming, and I can't go in key either.
Yeah.
So I remember on the ropes, we'd sit there with Teddy and be like, "Can you do like He'd be like, I don't know what you're doing." And for the last 15 years, I worked with Jeff Dana on all my films, and we have a shorthand. So I was really, I remember working when he was coming into LA for our first spotting session, thinking, oh my God, how am I gonna do this? And, but it's your film. I know my film pretty well. And he's coming into my house. So, there may have been that first time I was, actually, this is what happened. This is actually hysterical. I just remember this, Tom. The first 5 cues he sent me were freaking amazing. And I called him up. It was a total love fest. And I'm like, Philip, oh my God, this is the greatest. I'm so happy. I've listened to it over and over and over. Da-da-da. And he was like, well, you could, it's all right. You could tell me things you don't like about this stuff. I go, no, Phil, trust me. We'll have a time where that comes up. And I think on that first call, he just thought I was going to be like this for the whole film. And then we get the next batch of cues, and we ended up rejecting cue 6 to 31. And so it ended up getting rough. And, I think Philip thought it was going to be a 2-month process and turned into a 6-month process. But it was really important that, music plays such a big role in this film that we had to.
Are cues 6 through 31 laying around somewhere? Because there's probably some filmmakers who'd be happy to take those. So.
Can I tell you a funny story he told me, though? He told me when he works with Errol.
Errol Morris.
Yes, Errol Morris. That Errol will reject every track that he sends him. And Philip said he thinks he does it so he gets a fucking collection of temp track.
I would be surprised. Errol's a crafty guy. So, once you came around to doing this project, how do you feel like this film fits into your body of work? And do you think about that? I have a feeling that you probably do think about that.
I don't think of things in the sort of auteur sense of thematics, but I could probably write the best auteur study of my own work, because now, having made enough films to look back, I now know what the themes that I didn't realize I was drawn to, that I've always been drawn to, are. They're becoming crystallized.
Well, let's explicate that.
I'm not ready to go public with that yet.
Okay.
This is too painful for me. Look, at this point in my career, I look for subjects that have a sort of built-in audience, and how can I approach this film? What can I do to make this film a challenge for myself and unique? I don't want to make The Kid Stays in the Picture again. The one common link that I now can see with all my films is I always wanted to be the filmmaker who every film was 180 degrees. I consciously set out in my film career to be the guy that goes, every film is going to be totally different. And so, like Tom said, the first one was On the Ropes, which is like cinema verite shot like fiction. And then the second one was The Kid Stays in the Picture, was all photo animation. And then the third one, I'm like, all right, we're going to do motion capture on this one and combine that with archives. And then June 17th, this one I did for the, I don't know if anyone saw that, for 30 for 30, which is Day of the O.J. Bronco chase, was the only 30 for 30 ever made with no narration, no interviews. It's a 60-minute montage. So each one had its own challenge. But then I realized that ultimately they are all the same film, because what I'm doing with each film is telling a story about the past, but presenting it in the present tense. So, which is, if you think about it, very different from what as a genre things were prior to 2000. To me, documentaries growing up were people who were still alive testifying about things that happened. Now, I think some of this has to do with the advent of cinema, technologies that are accessible to my generation of filmmaking. Part of it may be that I may be of the first generation of documentary filmmakers who came at it entirely from dominant cinema, who spent his entire childhood, teenage years studying, Hollywood films, went to college for it, and then decided to take all that and apply it to nonfiction. But that was the thing with like The Kid, and even with On the Ropes, it was like we had to be present for everything, or figure out a visual way to make it happen. And what we learned on The Ropes, which is a cinema verite trick everyone knows, is like you can't cast characters at the beginning of Act 1. You have to cast them at the end of Act 1, because you don't know if anything's going to happen to them if it's the beginning of Act 1. So in On the Ropes, which we did a couple years ago, your thing, if you haven't seen the film, it's about a boxer and his, it's about a trainer and 3 boxers, and very dramatic narrative arcs with all of them. But when we found them, Tyrene had already been busted. Like George and Harry's relationship was falling apart, and we already knew, but then we knew that it'd be so easy to show George and Harry's relationship part 1 by just filming them at the gym and not having any conflict. Boom. Okay, now we can just pick up, you know what I mean? So that's always been a thing for Nanette as well, is trying to tell these stories in the present tense. With The Kid, it had to be because of Bob's narration. With Jane, that carries through with that tradition of inviting the audience to sort of be Jane and go on this journey.
Something that strikes me about Jane is that even though we are seeing her on camera telling her story in her 80s, you feel the experience of watching the film is you feel like you're watching her in the jungle in her 20s. And, sometimes filmmakers make choices. We should have a film here about Eric Clapton, where the filmmaker made a choice. She, the director, is not going to show Eric Clapton as present day talking about himself. We're just hearing that over the track without showing him on camera, so that we can be in the Eric Clapton of his 20s self.
That goes back to The Kid Stays in the Picture. That was the sole reason we decided to do The Kid with Bob off camera, because it was a movie about seduction, and it was a movie about imagery. So we needed the audience in The Kid Stays in the Picture to see Bob the way that his contemporaries saw him when he was 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. And that was always been my thing with nonfiction, is especially with the Stones. I didn't want to see Mick and all those guys at 70. I wanted to just be in the footage with them
Yeah.
And because that's how the world view them. Because anyone who's like 20 looking at this film about a 75-year-old talking about how cool he was is going to be, what are you talking about? and it's more exciting. And the other thing is, the reason I really hate talking heads more than anything is that they're taking up space. They're not very kinetic. And I'd rather, unless there's a reason to put them on screen, unless there's something you're telling me about the way they're emoting, or there's something in the visual association, then why am I looking at this? It's generally just seeing a head move is not the most exhilarating thing in the world. So given the choice between, also in a film like Crossfire Hurricane, cutting to Charlie Watts or Bill Wyman talking, no disrespect to those gentlemen, or seeing kinetic, raw footage, I'm going with the footage. Yeah. The reason with Jane, I decided to sort of put her on camera is, well, twofold. The entire movie is not about her looking back in her life, because the bulk of the narration was recorded when she was in her late 40s for a book on tape called Reason for Hope. We had the extreme pleasure with this film, which no one will ever have this again, of being able to use Jane's voice from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and into 80s, because she's told her stories so many times.
But it's kind of seamless. Lots of people's voices change as they get older. I feel like hers hasn't, or maybe you've done something in your sound treatments to get around that.
If you watch it again, it's very clearly delineated when it's her modern day interview from this more omniscient narration.
Okay.
And someone asked me the other day about almost the ethics of that. And I said, here's the thing. I'm always trying to use my subjects' art and their words and their voice and as much of their DNA in my films as possible, because my films are meant to not be the history of these subjects, but a sort of cinematic Jumanji, like a sort of the personification of the subjects. I just want to give people like a taste of them, a flavor of them that, in a way that's uniquely cinematic that you couldn't get in a book. And with Jane, so with her writing, Tom, if I ask you to say, so tell me about your first walking to college for the first time, and we're doing an interview.
I didn't go to college.
Okay. Now, you come up with something. Now, if I say to you, Tom, write me a couple paragraphs about your first days in college and then recite them back, it's probably going to be a little more lyrical. And what I noticed was Jane doing her own, these are her words in her narration, in her oration, and it was far more pure than anything I was going to be able to extract from her 35 years later. Especially with her musings, like the scene we just saw was from Reason for Hope, I believe, or excerpts of various excerpts, and it's her doing that spiritual thing, the rolling creeks. She would never. What question in an interview gets you that answer?
Right.
I don't know how to do that. So yeah.
So final question, because we've got just a couple minutes. Something I started before to ask you about, where do you think Jane fits into your body of work?
I think one of the fun things about getting older as a filmmaker and being able to continue to have opportunities to make films is that it's like love. Love is different at 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. What I'm interested in now is not necessarily what I would have been interested in 10 years ago, or even had the awareness to do. Like Montage of Heck, I had to go through some serious shit in my own before I could come out the other side at a place to tell that story. And with Jane, I was desperate. Making Kurt wasn't the dark part. Promoting Kurt was the dark part. That was devastating for me, going out for 6 months on the road with that film. And I needed to do something that was lighter. And I also wanted this challenge. I'm like, why do I keep making...
Not less serious, but more hopeful than...
Exactly. And I was like, why do I keep making films about these kind of degenerate, older, a lot of drugs and men, and why it wasn't a conscious choice, but like, I wanted to try something a little different. And I think I probably made the darkest Jane Goodall film one could make, if that's possible. Because I definitely wasn't coming at it from like, oh, Jane worship. I mean, listen, Jane is fallible. Her work with the chimpanzees, even with her work with the chimpanzees, she's fallible. In life, some of the decisions she made, everybody here would have a different take on it. But that is why I think the film works so much better than people anticipated it. Because even I would anticipate, I'm not going to go see the Jane Goodall documentary. Yeah, if you ask me to go see a Jane Goodall doc, I go, A, haven't I seen that at some point? B, how saccharine can you be? And like, no. Like, I'm just, I have no interest whatsoever in going to a Jane. And you would say, Brett, it's really good. Trust me. No, Tom, I'm not going to go see the Jane Goodall doc.
All right, so you've spelled out your marketing dilemma for this film.
Yeah, but that happened with the Rolling Stones too, where they were like, and I'm like, who's gonna go fit? Like, that seems like that's Best Buy presents the Rolling Stones 50th anniversary. It seems so cheesy. And that was what actually, when I told Mick I would take the job, that's what I told him. I said, the reason I'm doing this is because I wouldn't see this myself. Like, I know that sounds really weird, but I figured that people's expectations would be so low because they'd all be like me going, the Rolling Stones are making a 50th anniversary film for Best Buy. That's going to be the dumbest thing ever. And then like, oh, shit, it's kind of cool. And
I see in your future Barney, the documentary. Keep setting these challenges for yourself. We need to wrap up this portion. I think we're taking a half-hour break now, and we will be back in a half hour with more of Doc Conference. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to Brett Morgen.
Thank you.